On this channel, we'll talk a lot about how ego impacts life both negatively and positively, and how ego intersects with spirituality and psychology. And so to do this, I think we need a rock solid understanding between us about what ego is. So what I want to do in this video is to define how ego works and what it is. And to do this, I want to respond to a video from one of my favorite spiritual teachers, A-ARon Abke, who makes a video of his own defining what ego is and how it works. So let's get started.
The ego is not your instincts, intuition, or intentions. The ego is the reflexive mechanism that commentates on your instincts, intuition, and intentions. When in reality, we are pure consciousness that is simply observing the body and the mind.
What A-ARon is suggesting here is that ego creates the illusion of a self that's distinct and separate from everything else. It's like there's me, and there's the feeling of I, and there's the universe, and it's distinct and separate. A-ARon believes that what we actually are is pure conscious awareness, or just awareness. But here's my problem. There's no you apart from ego. Ego is you, and you are ego. They're one and the same. A-ARon thinks that by identifying as awareness, we're somehow getting around ego. But identifying as awareness, on my view, is no different than identifying with any other quality. Intelligence, your body, your thoughts. It's just another thought that ego can use to create that illusion of self and make it stronger. This is why we have to use very precise language when talking about ego, or we run into contradictions and just confusion. But I agree with A-ARon that ego doesn't exist as an entity on its own. It's more of like a biological operating system. Like the operating system on your computer, ego is receiving information from the environment that it gets through our five senses, our thoughts, our desires, our memories, our intentions. And from this information, it seeks to create a personal reality, a personality. And I think A-ARon would agree with this idea based on what he says in these next clips.
And so the first thing to understand about the origin of the ego is that it is a product of Darwinian evolution. It is a product of natural selection. We can pretty much surmise that the ego began at the advent or the invention of human language.
A-ARon and I both agree 100% that ego must have arose from the process of evolution and natural selection. After this, I think our views on ego differ quite dramatically. A-ARon thinks that ego must have arisen suddenly whenever humans started to use language and identify things and themselves using language. He says the brain would have needed to create some sort of mechanism to store the information and use that information to relate the organism to its environment and to the objects. But don't other animals also do this same thing? This is true because animals have the ability to recognize their own species from that of another species. And this ability requires, even if it's primitive, a concept of self. We know that social animals in particular are absolutely aware of how they relate to their tribe or their herd and the role that they play in it, even if they don't have language. Therefore, there's no reason to think that ego isn't present in simpler versions of lesser complex organisms when compared to humans. This is why I think that ego must be older, much, much older than development of language and of humans in general.
So you could say that the ego has acted as a chaperone for consciousness, sort of holding its hand through millions of years of evolution, because without the ego, we would not have had the natural impulse to go on reproducing and hunting and gathering and surviving. And so our species could have never evolved to get to the place where it is today.
The point we're both trying to make here is that you don't have to be human or have a highly advanced consciousness in order to have ego. You just have to be a life form with the ability to process information. Which leads me to my own definition of ego, that ego is an operating system for life, and the complexity of that operating system depends on the complexity of the organism. Perhaps ego in its simplest form is the ability to identify the difference between the organism and its environment.
Now, what is the function of the ego? As I said before, Because the ego is built through evolution, it is survival oriented. Because it is survival oriented, it is inherently focused on the negative.
From the point of view of evolution, you're more likely to survive if you have a negative orientation about your life, your surroundings, your environment. And ego certainly steps up to the plate here and colors most of our experience with this undercurrent of negativity. And if you think about it, for most of human history, we had to hunt for our food lest we become some meal of a hungry lion. And the fact that we have, even now in our current form, such a predisposition for negative emotions and feelings means that it apparently is much easier to motivate a human into action if you hardwire his brain for these kinds of feelings and emotions. The analogy A-ARon uses is that you're much more likely to notice a tiger crouching in some tall grass if you're feeling fear and anxiety and a little paranoid, as opposed to being a happy-go-lucky early human out on the plains of Africa. And haven't you noticed that our minds do in fact have a negative bias? They tend to gravitate towards negative feelings and thoughts and emotions without our even trying to. And we have to try really hard to experience positive emotions. It's like negative emotions are our default. So because ego is responsible for coloring our experience, it is also therefore responsible for the feelings of fear and anxiety.
The ego is obviously formless, and so because it has no form, it will identify with whatever is placed in front of it. And when I say placed in front of it, I don't mean necessarily a physical object, but an idea or a role you play or an identity you have or something you're attached to.
So this is the challenge we face. Ego not only wants to help us stay alive, but it wants to do so by creating a sense that you exist, that I exist as something. And how do you know you exist? Because you're experiencing all of this. You can taste it and you can touch it and you can see it. You can't really operate as a human being without this feeling that you exist and that you're real. But ego is not perfect, and this process of verifying that you're real and that you exist by identifying with things in the environment is subject to flaws, and when it does not work, we call this psychosis. Fortunately for most of us though, we can cut through the illusion of ego without breaking down into a psychotic state. And this is really where the journey begins, with the acceptance that you're not the car you drive, or the house you live in, or the thoughts you have, or the body you wake up in each morning. You are an illusion that ego creates using all of these objects.
Everything that is placed in front of the ego with your attention and your interest is then endowed with a sense of identity. And so obviously the most common two things that are constantly being placed in front of the ego is the body and the mind. So the ego doesn't just say, I have a body and a mind, but it says, I am the body and the mind. And this is what makes us vulnerable to suffering, because when our mind, our ideas or opinions are threatened, or when our body is threatened, we feel as though we are being threatened.
Not only does identifying with these objects make you vulnerable to suffering, it makes you vulnerable to embarrassment, to self-hatred, depression. But this is our dilemma. We can't permanently delete ego. We need it to operate. We need it to feel like a human. The best we can do is to practice reminding ourselves that we aren't the material or immaterial things in our life. And one way to do this is through mindfulness meditation, which is the practice of observing your thoughts and sensations in your body as they come and go like they always do. This will help reduce some of the nasty side effects of ego, but only a tiny little bit. But hey, after a year like 2020, where nobody's safe anymore, every little bit counts.
And so the truth is that the ego dies when you no longer have use for it anymore. When you are no longer giving your attention to all of these triggered mind programs, then they begin to break themselves down.
A-ARon seems to think that it's possible to rid yourself of ego, and I don't know how he arrives at this belief given his own definition of what ego is. He said himself that ego is a reflexive mind program, and yet he believes that you can get rid of it by acknowledging its unreality. But in any case, A-ARon is still left with the feeling that I am something, even if it's I am awareness. And on my view, ego is still the mechanism that is used to identify as awareness. That's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Click that like button if you liked the video. If you did not like the video, hit the dislike button and feel free to leave me a nasty comment in the comment section. I'm kidding, not really. I want this channel to inspire a new kind of conversation. I really do feel like the world is going through a kind of transformation towards betterment, towards positivity. And I think that honest conversations about our flaws speed up this transformation. So if you like this content that's geared towards how ego manifests in our life and how we can avoid the problems that arise, definitely subscribe to this channel and I think you'll get a lot out of it. So thanks again for watching and I'll see you in the next video.